This is a long-buried historical mystery, a story about a female pope in the Roman Catholic Church. It is said that during the Middle Ages in Europe, between the papacies of Pope Leo IV and Benedict III, there was a female pope named Johanna. Her identity as a woman was exposed when she gave birth in public, and as a result, the Church erased all traces of her from Vatican history. It is said that because of this female pope incident, all subsequent popes had to undergo a physical examination before taking office. Since the Roman Catholic Church does not allow women to become pope and has never admitted the existence of this female pope, the truth of the story remains a mystery to this day. In the wild and dark medieval Europe, material life was extremely scarce, which only further highlighted the terrifying intensity of faith and spirituality. The Catholic Church, which monopolized education, strongly rejected women, and church schools refused to allow them to gain knowledge. Some nobles and missionaries even distorted Christian doctrine to promote the idea that women were merely machines for childbirth and laborers for all household tasks, in order to justify their oppression of women, and Johanna's father was a typical example of this. As a devout missionary who firmly believed in Catholic teachings, he despised all women and wouldn't even lend a hand when his wife was giving birth. To ease the woman's pain, the midwife hurriedly brought out some herbal medicine, but the father snatched it away and threw it straight into the fire. Fortunately, the midwife was skilled enough, and the child was born safely. When he saw that the baby was a girl, the father was filled with despair, gave her the name Johanna without much thought, and walked away with indifference. 5 years later, Johanna gradually grew up, and she was naturally intelligent and eager to learn. Her mother often taught her some knowledge about herbs, but Johanna's father forbade her from studying, believing that allowing women to gain knowledge was a blasphemy against God. But Johanna had an extraordinary thirst for knowledge, and she begged her brother Matthew to teach her Latin. Seeing the eager look in his sister's eyes, Matthew couldn't bear to refuse, so he secretly taught Johanna behind their father's back. Matthew also had a younger brother named Johannes, but he had no interest in studying at all. As native Germans, their mother often told Johanna stories from Norse mythology. Unfortunately, their conversation was overheard by their father. As a die-hard follower of the Catholic Church, he became furious, believing this was blasphemy against God, and he brutally beat his wife before driving all the children out of the house, letting the heavy rain punish their bodies as a divine punishment for offending God. But after being soaked in the rain, Matthew caught a cold the next day. Given the poor medical conditions at the time, people could only rely on their own physical resilience to recover, and the father was at a loss. Doing nothing but praying continuously beside his son's sickbed, Matthew gave his sister the St. Catherine medallion he had always worn, hoping that St. Catherine could guide her just like a sister would. In the end, he couldn't make it through, and the family held a funeral for Matthew. Not long after, a Greek monk from Byzantium arrived. He had previously recommended that Matthew go to the church for further study, but now that Matthew was dead, the monk wanted to recommend another child to the church. The father was delighted and immediately nominated his second son, Johannes, falsely claiming that he was a hard-working and studious child. The Greek monk didn't agree right away and instead began observing the two children. After spending several days with them, he realized that Johannes had no interest or talent for learning, while Johanna was intelligent and had unique insights into everything. Knowing the church would never accept a little girl, the Greek monk decided to teach Johanna personally, but the father was very displeased and said, "If you want to teach, then teach both children, or neither of them gets to learn." And so, the Greek monk began a journey of teaching both children. Besides teaching them Latin and Greek, the monk had them read various ancient texts and taught them about astronomy. However, good days never last long. After some time, the Greek monk received a summons from the bishop and was about to return to serve in the Byzantine church. Before he left, he gave Johanna a handwritten copy of Homer's Odyssey, hoping it would help her continue learning Greek. In the days that followed, Johanna studied diligently every day, afraid of missing any bit of knowledge. Unfortunately, her books were discovered by her father. She removed her outer garment and exposed her back, and her father's cane struck her hard across the skin, forcing her to recite the Lord's Prayer to repent to God. And all of this was because of a book. Her devout Catholic father believed that Greek was the language of pagans, so he picked up the book and was ready to tear it apart. But considering that paper was expensive, he instead told Johanna to scrape off the words with a knife and save the paper. However, the task was nearly impossible, and when Johanna failed, she was beaten again. Sometime later, a messenger from the local bishop arrived in the village. It turned out that the Greek monk had written a letter of recommendation, hoping the bishop would allow Johanna to study at the church school. When the admission letter arrived, The father couldn't believe it and insisted that the bishop must have written the wrong name, that it should have been his son Johannes, not his daughter, and what good could come from sending a girl to school anyway? The messenger was speechless at how absurd this family was. Under the father's insistence, the messenger reluctantly took Johannes with him, while Johanna could only stand aside, full of resentment at her father's injustice. But on the way to the school, the messenger was attacked by bandits and killed on the spot. Johannes barely managed to escape using a small knife. That night, Johanna made up her mind to escape from this nightmarish home. When her mother discovered her plan, she didn't try to stop her, but was instead happy that her daughter had made her own choice. On the road, Johanna reunited with her lost and confused brother, and the two embraced joyfully. After that, the siblings decided to go to school together, but when they arrived at the church, they found it quite different from what they had imagined. The bishop was obsessed with wine and pleasure all day and had no interest in church affairs. When he learned that the two were here to enroll in school, he asked the school head, Odo, for his opinion. Odo was extremely displeased and said, "Women are not suited for learning, because the usable part of their brains is very small. Compared to men, women simply have no logical ability." Hearing this, Johanna immediately countered with the original text of the Bible. Her response left Odo speechless, and the bishop was impressed by Johanna's wit, so he admitted both her and her brother on the spot. But Johanna's housing became a big issue, as she couldn't stay with the male students. At that moment, a nobleman named Gerald offered to let Johanna live at his home, where she could be accompanied by his two daughters. However, Gerald's wife, Richard, didn't like Johanna, but under her husband's insistence, she reluctantly agreed. And so, Johanna began her academic journey, although Principal Odo remained prejudiced against her and constantly found reasons to punish her. She still cherished this precious opportunity to study. Time flew by, and 7 years later, Johanna had grown into an adult. During these years of learning, she not only gained knowledge but also found love. The one she loved was none other than Gerald, who had taken her in. Gerald had a deep interest in Greek engineering, and since Johanna understood Greek, the two often spent time together, and over time, their feelings naturally developed. Unfortunately, their secret affair was discovered by Principal Odo. Odo immediately informed Gerald's wife, Richard. By identity, Johanna was considered Gerald's adopted daughter, and such a relationship was not permitted by the church. At this time, as Viking forces from Norway launched a massive invasion southward, Gerald, being a knight, was called to military service. Ignoring the judgmental eyes of society, Johanna picked flowers and gave them to Gerald, watching him leave with reluctance. After her husband's departure, Richard began her revenge against Johanna, claiming guardianship rights. She arranged Johanna to marry the son of a blacksmith and lied that it was Gerald's decision. Since Johanna was about to get married, she had to leave the school, and her brother Johannes was also implicated and sent to a remote monastery to become a monk. This deeply upset Johannes, who had always dreamed of living in a big city, and he began to resent his sister. Soon after, under the bishop's blessing, the wedding proceeded as scheduled. Just as the ceremony was about to be completed, a man suddenly burst in. He drew a longsword and, to the shock of everyone, walked straight up to the bishop. It was a Viking invader from the south. With one slash, he split the Bible in half, then raised his sword again and beheaded the bishop. Panic erupted instantly, and the Vikings, who had been lying in ambush outside, stormed in. Inside the small church, filled with unarmed civilians, it turned into a one-sided massacre. Just as Johanna was about to be killed, Johannes stepped in to save her. To protect his sister, he was forced to take up arms and fight the Vikings, while Johanna was knocked unconscious by a shield. When she woke up, what she saw was a blood-soaked church floor, with bodies everywhere. Everyone was dead except her. Seeing her brother who had died for her, Johanna was overwhelmed with grief, but life still had to go on. By chance, she found her brother's appointment letter, so she cut off her long hair, bound her chest, and assumed her brother's identity to head to the monastery, completely disguising herself as a man. Meanwhile, Gerald returned to his homeland, only to find it reduced to ruins. His wife and children had been slaughtered by the Vikings, and Johanna was nowhere to be found. Having lost everything, he once again threw himself into the battlefield. On the other side, since Johanna was fluent in Greek, the abbot assigned her to translate various Greek medical texts, and with the medical knowledge passed down from her mother, a monk named Origes took the initiative to accept her as his apprentice. During her time at the monastery, Johanna experienced a sense of joy and freedom she had never felt before. She no longer had to worry about the judgment of others and could openly pursue all kinds of knowledge. Of course, To hide her identity as a woman, Johanna endured a lot of hardship, but fortunately, no one ever discovered her secret. One day, the monastery was preparing to detain a group of leprosy patients, and among them, a woman who had been misdiagnosed began to cry. Since she had no husband, if she were locked away, her child would surely starve to death. The abbot coldly said, "You may be dead in the eyes of the world, but still you live in the eyes of the Lord." Johanna couldn't bear to watch, and after her own diagnosis, she discovered that the woman did not actually have leprosy, though the symptoms were similar. The condition was not contagious. She pleaded with the abbot to let her treat the woman alone. The abbot didn't want to take that risk, but under the appeal and guarantee of Brother Ariges, he eventually agreed, on the condition that the treatment be done outside the monastery. So Johanna followed the woman back to her home and began her treatment. During this time, Johanna also became good friends with the woman's son, Arne. What they didn't know was that a drama destined to reshape the future of Europe was unfolding in the background. At that time, the powerful Frankish Empire, which ruled over most of Europe, was facing division. After the death of Louis the Pious, the empire was split into three parts, with the eldest son, Lothair I, receiving the Italian territories and inheriting the Roman title. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted control of the entire Frankish realm. Thus, war broke out between him and his two younger brothers, and Gerald was now serving under Lothair's command. After 3 years of war, Lothair was finally defeated and forced to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Verdun was signed, and from then on, the tripartite division of Europe was officially established. Sometime later, Johanna brought the woman back to the monastery. When the monks saw the woman fully recovered, they were stunned. It was nothing short of a miracle. Johanna's reputation spread far and wide as a result. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before a sudden fever swept through the monastery, and Johanna was among those infected. To treat her, the monks wanted to remove her robe and cool her body with cold water, but Johanna refused. If her identity as a woman were exposed, she would be sentenced to death. Seeing her intense reaction, Brother Ariges dismissed the other monks and spoke to Johanna in private. As it turned out, Ariges had already discovered her secret, that Johanna was a woman. Now that the secret was at risk of exposure, Ariges told her she had to leave the monastery immediately. Johanna had no choice but to board a small boat alone and drift down the river, waiting for God to guide her fate. Fortunately, Johanna, who had passed out from a high fever, was rescued, and the one who took her in was none other than Arne. From years ago, Johanna stayed at Arne's home to recover. However, having lived a free and independent life like a man, the quiet countryside no longer satisfied her ambitions. After regaining her health, Johanna decided to embark on a solo pilgrimage to Rome. Before leaving, Johanna gave her St. Catherine medallion to Arne's daughter and urged her to study hard, so she could use knowledge to help those around her. Then, Johanna led a small donkey and bid a reluctant farewell to the kind family. In medieval Europe, where theological belief dominated all, illness was often seen as punishment from God. Most doctors at the time were religious fanatics who believed that healing the soul was far more important than curing the body. This led to the development of many bizarre medical practices. They would cut open a patient's arm with a small knife, letting the blood flow into a delicate bowl. This was the wildly popular bloodletting therapy of the Middle Ages, and the one undergoing this treatment was none other than the Pope of Rome, Sergius. Unfortunately, this so-called cure didn't seem to be doing him any good. Because the Pope of Rome was gravely ill and unable to govern, the papal aide Anastasius began to harbor sinister thoughts. He too had ambitions for the throne of St. Peter's Basilica. If he could cure the Pope and gain public prestige, then with the support of the cardinals, he could be elected the next Pope. So he sent someone to find Johanna. In the years since arriving in Rome for pilgrimage, Johanna had become a well-known physician thanks to her exceptional medical skills. When she arrived at the Pope's chambers, Johanna presented the herbs she had prepared. The bishops denounced this act as pagan witchcraft, but Anastasius had faith in Johanna's ability. After her diagnosis, Johanna discovered that the Pope wasn't suffering from a fatal disease at all. It was merely gout. Hippocrates had described this condition clearly long ago, so she quickly prepared the proper medicine for the Pope. While caring for the Pope, Johanna accidentally overheard Anastasius discussing his plan to seize power. Not long after, the Pope miraculously recovered. Though the disease wasn't completely cured, he was well enough to resume normal life. Grateful for Johanna's help, the Pope decided to keep her in the Vatican. In his eyes, this young monk not only possessed superb medical skills, but also noble character and vast knowledge. Johanna also subtly warned the Pope about Anastasius's conspiracy. From that point on, the Pope began to trust Johanna more and more. she gradually replaced Anastasius and became the Pope's closest confidant, rising into the political elite of the Vatican. At that time, Lothair I, Emperor of Middle Francia, wanted to imitate his grandfather Charlemagne by leading his army to attack the Vatican, trying to force the Pope to acknowledge his legitimacy. And the one who extended the invitation was none other than the now disgraced Anastasius. Lothair approached the Pope and demanded his submission, but instead of answering, the Pope shouted, "Give us a sign." Right at that moment, the church doors suddenly slammed shut by themselves. In fact, this was all Johanna's idea. She had studied Greek engineering and had designed this mechanism herself. Seeing what they believed to be a divine miracle, the soldiers immediately dropped their weapons and knelt to ask for God's forgiveness. Although Lothair didn't believe in any of it, he knew that continuing to pressure the Pope now would stir unrest among his troops, so he had no choice but to kneel in submission. Gerald recognized the mechanism as Johanna's design, as it was something the two of them had worked on together. Worried, he left the army and searched for Johanna. Finally, the two former lovers met again in a humble chapel, but Johanna had no intention of forgiving Gerald. In her eyes, Gerald was the one who gave up on their love. It wasn't until Gerald showed her the flower she had given him years ago that Johanna realized he had never stopped loving her. And so, they rekindled their romance. To honor Johanna, the Pope officially appointed her as his papal aide, completely replacing Anastasius. But Anastasius was far from giving up. He secretly met with Lothair again to plan their next move. Lothair suggested killing Johanna, but Anastasius already had another plan. Instead of cutting off the branch, why not pull up the root? Lothair understood Anastasius wanted to eliminate the Pope. To avoid suspicion, Lothair immediately withdrew his troops from the Vatican. That night, Johanna and Gerald walked by the riverside. There, she finally shed her disguise and, for the first time in years, gave herself to Gerald as a woman. Elsewhere, Anastasius had arranged for a poisoned feast to be delivered to the Pope. The next morning, Johanna was jolted awake by the frantic tolling of church bells. She rushed back to the Vatican on horseback, only to find that the Pope had already died from the poison. Soon after, the Roman Church organized a papal election. Each cardinal nominated their preferred candidate, offering justifications to win over Roman support. Anastasius had already bribed many bishops in advance and thus secured a nomination. However, a former confidant of the Pope suddenly stepped forward and began to speak about his vision for the future of Rome's papacy. At this point, Gerald was already planning to escape with Johanna, knowing that if Anastasius were elected Pope, Johanna's life would surely be in danger. Just as the two were preparing to leave, the cardinals suddenly came to Johanna. It turned out that because of the former papal aide's powerful speech, everyone had turned to support Johanna. Through the election, she would become the next pope. With holy ceremony and the cheers of the people, a woman thus became the leader of the Catholic world. After becoming pope, in order to stay with the man she loved, Johanna appointed Gerald as her papal guard. But this decision brought unexpected trouble. Johanna became pregnant. As her belly grew, it became clear her identity as a woman would soon be exposed, so the two planned to escape together on Easter. Meanwhile, Anastasius, eager to regain power, gathered some cardinals who were dissatisfied with the Pope, and plotted to eliminate Gerald and then pressure the Pope with force. One day in the year 847, the Pope led a large procession through the streets of Rome. Due to her pregnancy, Johanna began to feel unwell, but in order not to interrupt the procession, she gritted her teeth and endured it. When the parade reached a certain district, a few beggars in the crowd threw a dead rat at Johanna. An enraged Gerald immediately chased after them, but it was a trap. The beggars were actually assassins sent by Anastasius. They quickly surrounded Gerald and prepared to kill him. At that moment, Johanna grew anxious for Gerald's safety, and in her distress, she was struck by sharp pain in her abdomen. In the end, Gerald was brutally killed by the assassins, and Johanna, in extreme panic, suffered a miscarriage. Covered in blood, she crawled toward the open cathedral doors, struggling with all her strength. But ultimately, she passed away with regret in her heart. Only then did the people realize that the Pope they had revered all this time was actually a woman. In the end, Johanna's story was erased by the Vatican, because the Roman Church could not accept such a disgrace. However, 40 years later, Bishop Arnaldo of Paris came to the Vatican to revise the papal records. While reviewing the unbound pages, he found no mention of the female pope, but he knew well that she had truly existed, so he personally wrote a manuscript documenting the life of this extraordinary woman. After finishing his work, The bishop walked out of the Vatican alone and took out the necklace he had worn all along. That necklace was the St. Catherine medallion that once belonged to Johanna. This bishop from Paris was in fact the daughter of Arne, the very same girl Johanna had once gifted the medallion to. She had walked the same path Johanna once did. And with that, the film comes to an end. Since the Roman Catholic Church has never acknowledged this story, we can only consider it a legend, but in my personal opinion, the credibility of this event is quite low. Although she was once regarded as a real historical figure during the Middle Ages, with no one questioning her existence. Even Giovanni Boccaccio, author of the Decameron, mentioned the female pope in his 1353 work. A closer examination reveals many flaws, as almost all versions of the story contradict themselves. Nevertheless, the significance of this film and the story behind it is that it helps us understand the tragic fate of women in medieval Europe. I'm a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.